He was a tracker who trusted no one, a man living between two worlds. In a single act of courage, he saved a beautiful Apache warrior from a ruthless bounty hunter. But in saving her life, he was about to lose his own heart. This is their story. Ethan Cole moved through the canyons like a ghost. His world was one of signs and silence, the print of a shod horse in the dust, the nervous chatter of a quail, the subtle shift of the wind. A former Army scout, he had seen enough of the bitter, bloody conflict between the settlers and the native tribes to want no part in either side. He had left that life behind, retreating to the solitude of the wilderness, haunted by the memory of a massacre he had failed to prevent. Now, he trusted only the land, its harsh logic, and the weight of the Colt revolver at his hip. He was tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on a homesteader's cattle, a simple, honest task in a world that was anything but. It was the unnatural silence that first alerted him. The birds had stopped singing. The air, usually alive with the hum of insects, was still and heavy. Then, a sound that ripped through the peace of the afternoon, a single, sharp crack of a rifle, followed by a defiant war cry. Cut short. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively going to his gun. He moved silently towards the sound, using the rocks and sparse brush for cover, his every sense on high alert. Peering over a rocky ledge, he saw a scene of brutal carnage. In a small clearing below, 3 Apache hunters lay dead or dying. Standing over them were 4 white men, their faces flushed with a grim victory. Leading them was a man Ethan recognized with a cold knot of dread in his stomach, Jedediah Kane. A bounty hunter known for his cruelty, a man who hunted Apache not for justice, but for sport and the government gold that came with their scalps. But they were not alone. Cornered against a sheer rock face was a lone survivor, a woman. She held a long knife, her knuckles white, her body poised like a cornered wolf. She was young, her face streaked with dirt and the war paint of her people, but her eyes burned with a fire of pure, undiluted defiance. Even outnumbered and facing certain death, she showed no fear, only a burning hatred. Kane and his men were circling her, laughing, enjoying her desperation. Ethan's past came rushing back, the smoke, the screams, the faces of the innocent he couldn't save. He had sworn never to interfere again, but to stand by and watch this woman be slaughtered or captured for Kane's sadistic pleasure was a line he could not cross. His conscience, a thing he thought long dead, roared back to life. In that moment, a choice was made. He didn't charge in like a fool. He was a scout, a strategist. He noted Kane's men were spread out, overconfident. He noted the precarious pile of loose rocks on the ledge above them. With silent precision, he raised his rifle. He didn't aim for a man. He aimed for a small keystone at the base of the rock slide. The rifle cracked. The stone shattered. With a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar, tons of rock and dust cascaded down into the clearing, separating Kane from 2 of his men. In the ensuing chaos of dust and confusion, Ethan slid down the other side of the ledge. He fired 2 quick, precise shots, not to kill, but to injure, sending the 2 men closest to the woman scrambling for cover with bullets in their legs. Kane, enraged, began firing blindly into the dust cloud. It was the opening they needed. Ethan lunged for the woman, grabbing her arm. She reacted instantly, spinning with her knife, the blade flashing towards his throat. He caught her wrist, their faces inches apart. For a split second, he was lost in the fury of her dark eyes. "I'm not with them. A diversion. We have to go. Now." He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled her with him, dragging her into a narrow crevice between the rocks he had scouted earlier, a path only a man who knew these canyons would see. They scrambled through the tight passage as Kane's enraged shouts and gunfire echoed behind them. They ran, not stopping for breath, until the sounds of the hunt faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. He had saved her, but as he looked at the proud, fierce, and beautiful woman beside him, her chest heaving, her eyes still burning with suspicion and hatred, he had a sinking feeling that his quiet, solitary life was over forever. They moved for hours, a silent, tense procession of 2. Ethan led, not looking back, but every sense was attuned to the woman following him. He could hear the slight drag of her moccasin, a sign of the injury she was trying to hide. She, in turn, followed with a warrior's discipline, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her hand never straying far from the knife at her belt. She did not trust him. To her, he was just a different kind of white man, his motives as hidden and dangerous as a snake in the rocks. His act of rescue could have been a trick, a way to capture her for his own purposes. They made camp as dusk painted the canyons in shades of deep red and purple. Ethan chose a small, hidden alcove, a place easily defended. He gestured for her to sit, then went about his tasks with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in the wild. He started a small, smokeless fire, not for warmth, but to heat water. He could see the gash on her leg now, a deep cut from a ricocheting bullet or a sharp rock. It was festering in the heat. He approached her slowly, holding a clean cloth in his canteen. She flinched, her body tensing, her hand tightening on her knife. He stopped immediately, holding up his empty hands in a universal sign of peace. He placed the cloth and canteen on the ground between them, then backed away to his side of the fire, giving her space. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that she was not his prisoner. He watched as she, after a long, hesitant moment, began to tend to her own wound. Her movements were pained but precise. As she worked, Ethan did something that would mark the first, tiny crack in the wall of her mistrust. He turned his back to her. In her culture, and in the harsh code of the wilderness, turning your back on someone was a sign of ultimate vulnerability or ultimate trust. He was giving her the chance to attack him without fear of reprisal, and in doing so, he was showing her he was not her enemy. For a long while, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and her sharp, controlled breaths of pain. The days that followed were a silent education in mutual respect. They traveled towards his hidden cabin, deep in the mountains. He hunted, bringing back a rabbit. He skinned it and prepared it, but before he ate, he took a small piece of the meat and offered it to the four directions and the earth. A gesture of thanks he had learned from an old Navajo scout years ago. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes. It was a custom of her people, a sign that this white man understood things others did not. She, in turn, began to reveal her own skills. While he tracked the game, she identified edible roots and plants he had overlooked, her knowledge of the desert's hidden bounty far exceeding his own. One afternoon, he watched, fascinated, as she found a specific type of yucca plant, and, using her knife and a stone, began to pound the root into a lather, creating a natural soap to clean her wounds and her hair. She was not a helpless victim. She was a survivor, a woman of profound knowledge and capability. When they finally reached his cabin, it was a simple, solitary place, built into the side of a mountain, almost invisible from a distance. It was the home of a man who did not wish to be found. Inside, he gave her the single cot to sleep on, while he took a bedroll on the floor by the door. He never entered her space without a quiet signal, never made her feel trapped. He moved with a quiet deference that was the opposite of the aggressive dominance she had come to expect from his kind. A week passed. The physical wound on her leg began to heal, but the deeper wound, the one of mistrust, was slower to mend. She would watch him for hours, her expression unreadable, trying to understand the man who had saved her. He was a paradox, a white man who lived like a native, a man with the skills of a killer but the quiet demeanor of a monk. He would spend his evenings sharpening his knives or oiling his rifle, but he also read from a worn, leather-bound book of poetry, his lips moving silently, a relic from a past life she couldn't imagine. The silence between them was no longer one of hostility, but of cautious observation. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions. He wanted to ask her name, her story, what Cain wanted with her. She wanted to ask him why he had helped her, what had carved the deep lines of sorrow around his eyes. But words were a bridge neither was yet ready to cross. For now, their understanding was built on a foundation of shared actions and mutual respect. He was the man who had turned his back. She was the woman who had chosen not to put a knife in it. In the vast, dangerous wilderness, it was a start. A month had passed since the ambush. The wound on Tala's leg had healed into a thin, pale scar. The harsh memory of the attack had begun to fade, replaced by the quiet, predictable rhythm of life in Ethan's hidden sanctuary. The wall of silence between them remained, but it was no longer a barrier of mistrust. It had become a shared space, a comfortable quiet filled with the small sounds of their coexistence. The scrape of his knife on wood as he carved, the soft thud of her hands as she ground corn into meal. One evening, as a cold rain drummed against the roof, Ethan was meticulously cleaning his rifle, a task he performed with ritualistic focus. Tala sat by the fire, stitching a tear in her buckskin tunic with a needle and sinew he had provided. She watched him, her gaze thoughtful. She had observed him for weeks and had seen nothing but honor and a deep, abiding respect. She had seen the way he left food for the spirits, the way he moved through the forest without disturbing it, the way his eyes held a sadness that mirrored her own grief for her fallen kinsman. She decided it was time. She spoke, and the sound of her voice in the small cabin was as startling and beautiful as the first flower of spring after a long winter. She did not speak in his tongue. She spoke in her own, the soft, melodic cadence of the Apache language. "My name is Tala. I am Apache." Ethan froze, his hand stilling on the rifle. He slowly looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He did not understand all the words, but he understood enough. He had learned snippets of the language during his time as a scout, enough to know she had just given him her name and the name of her people. It was a gift of immense trust, a formal opening of the door she had kept so firmly barred. He laid his rifle aside, giving her his full, undivided attention. And just like that, the dam of silence broke. They began to talk, a slow, careful exchange in a patchwork of two languages and hand gestures. She told him of her family, of her father the chief, of the beauty of her home in the sacred valley. He, in turn, told her of his life as a scout, of the farm he had grown up on, of the reasons he had sought solitude in the mountains. They spoke late into the night, two worlds colliding not in violence, but in a quiet, profound act of understanding. For the first time, they were not just a white man and an Apache woman. They were Ethan and Tala. The next morning, the world felt new, charged with the energy of their newfound connection. A barrier had fallen, and an easy companionship was blossoming in its place. Ethan found himself smiling, a rare and unfamiliar feeling. As he was checking his snares near the edge of his territory, his good mood vanished in an instant, replaced by a cold dread. There, tied to the branch of a juniper tree, was a small, dirty piece of calico cloth. It was a trail marker, but it wasn't from any tribe he knew. It was the signature of a white tracker, and he knew instantly who it belonged to: Jedediah Kane. The bounty hunter was still out there. He hadn't given up. He was circling, testing the boundaries of Ethan's territory, hunting them like a patient wolf. He returned to the cabin, his face grim. He didn't need to say a word. Tala saw the marker in his hand, and the warmth of the previous night evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of their situation. The sanctuary was no longer safe. The monster was sniffing at their door. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a new, urgent question. She spoke in her language, a question he understood perfectly even without knowing all the words. Why? Why was Kane so relentless? A simple bounty for an Apache scalp, even a woman's, would not justify a month-long hunt. There had to be something more. She was not just a random victim. Kane was hunting her specifically. The danger that had brought them together was back, but now it was personal. And as Ethan looked at her, at the fierce, beautiful woman whose life was now intertwined with his, he knew he could no longer just hide her. He would have to fight for her. The discovery of Kane's trail marker shattered their fragile peace. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every gust of wind, every snap of a twig outside, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They were no longer hiding. They were being hunted. Ethan knew they couldn't stay. Kane was patient, and he was methodical. Sooner or later, he would find the cabin. Their only chance was to move, to try and reach the relative safety of Tala's tribal lands. A journey of many days across a harsh and unforgiving landscape. As he prepared for their journey, Ethan's mind raced. Tala's question from the night before echoed in his thoughts. Why was Cain so obsessed? It didn't make sense. The risk was too high, the time too long for a standard bounty. He looked at Tala, who was now preparing her own small bundle. She was a warrior, but she was also the daughter of a chief. Perhaps that was it, a high-value target for a man like Cain. They left at dawn, moving not as a man and a woman, but as two skilled trackers, their every step careful and deliberate, meant to leave as little trace as possible. They traveled for 2 days, pushing themselves to the limit, the threat of Cain, a constant shadow at their backs. On the third night, as they made a cold camp in a high, rocky pass, Tala decided it was time for him to know the full truth. She had given him her name, now she had to give him her burden. She sat by the small, smokeless fire and began to speak, her voice a low, somber murmur. She told him that her hunting party had not been on a simple hunt for food. They were on a sacred mission, returning from a secret meeting with a faction of the U.S. Army, a forward-thinking colonel who genuinely sought peace. From a hidden pouch in her tunic, she carefully withdrew a small, beautifully beaded deerskin parcel. It was a treaty pouch. She explained that it was a sacred object, a visual record of her people's history and their claim to the sacred valley they called the Heart of the Mountain. The pouch contained symbols, beaded patterns, and sacred tokens that documented generations of her tribe's ownership of the land. The twist, she revealed, was what the land contained. Recent surveys, conducted in secret by the peace-seeking colonel, had confirmed the valley was rich with silver. A massive, untapped vein that would make any man a king. The treaty pouch was the only thing preventing the land from being declared unclaimed territory and open to prospectors. It was her people's only legal defense. The colonel had been trying to get the treaty officially recognized, but there were powerful forces working against him. Cain was not working for the army. He was working for a man who had learned of the silver, a corrupt, ruthless land baron named Silas Croft, who was funding a secret, illegal war to wipe out her people and seize the valley. The bounty on her head was not for her scalp, but for the treaty pouch she carried. Cain's mission was to kill her and her party, destroy the evidence of their meeting with the colonel, and make it look like a random Apache attack, thereby nullifying any peace talks and leaving the valley ripe for the taking. The weight of her confession settled between them, as heavy as the mountains that surrounded them. This was no longer just her fight for survival. It was a fight for the future of her entire tribe. And Ethan, by saving her, had unknowingly stepped into the middle of this secret war. He now understood the fury in Cain's eyes, the relentless nature of his hunt. It was never about a simple bounty. It was about greed on a scale that could reshape the entire territory. He looked at the treaty pouch in her hands, then at her face, illuminated by the firelight. He saw not just a proud warrior, but a guardian, a young woman carrying the fate of her people. The danger was immense, far greater than he had ever imagined. To continue helping her now was not just an act of honor. It was an act of rebellion against the powerful men who ran this land. He could leave her, ride away, and disappear back into his solitary life, and no one would ever know. But as he looked into her determined eyes, he knew that was a choice he could no longer make. Her fight had become his fight. Her people's future was now tied to his own. He reached out and gently touched the treaty pouch, a silent vow passing between them. He would not abandon her. He would see her home, no matter the cost. With the full weight of the truth now between them, their journey took on a new, desperate urgency. They were no longer just fleeing a bounty hunter. They were guardians of a people's future, racing against a wave of greed that threatened to consume everything. They traveled through the harshest terrain, avoiding the main trails, their path a winding, difficult line through treacherous canyons and high, windswept mesas. Ethan's knowledge of the wilderness kept them hidden, and Tala's resilience seemed limitless. The bond between them, forged in silence and now tempered by a shared, dangerous purpose, was absolute. But Cain was relentless, and he was not alone. On the 5th day of their journey, as they looked down from a high ridge, their hearts sank. Below them, crossing the valley floor, was a posse of at least 6 riders, led by the unmistakable figure of Jedediah Kane. He had recruited hired guns, men who cared nothing for the law and everything for Silas Croft's silver. They were being herded, driven towards a natural choke point, a narrow, box canyon with no other exit. They were trapped. To fight was suicide. To surrender was to hand over the future of Tala's people to their enemies and to condemn her to certain death. They found temporary cover in a small cave carved into the canyon wall, the sound of the approaching horses growing louder with each passing minute. The end seemed inevitable. Tala clutched the treaty pouch, her face a mask of grim determination. She was prepared to die fighting, to take as many of them with her as she could. But Ethan looked at her fierce, unbroken spirit, and knew he could not let her story end here. In this dusty, forgotten canyon, he had failed to save a family once before. He would not fail again. In that desperate moment, he made his all-in move. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. He told her, his voice low and urgent, that there was only one way. One of them had to lead the hunters away, while the other took the pouch and escaped over the high ridge to the north, a treacherous climb that a lone person might just be able to make. Before she could protest, he pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of a desperate, profound farewell. It was a kiss that said everything he had never found the words for. Your people need this. You need to live. I will lead them away. He pressed his own small satchel of supplies into her hands. He told her to wait for his signal, then to climb and not look back. He was giving her the only thing he had left to give, his life. It was not just an act of a scout or an ally. It was an act of pure, selfless love. Without another word, he chambered a round in his rifle, took a deep breath, and stepped out from behind the rocks. He fired a single, defiant shot into the air. Kane's posse immediately wheeled their horses towards the sound. Ethan, now fully exposed, began to run, not towards the safety of the ridge, but deeper into the labyrinth of the canyon. A deliberate decoy leading the wolves away from their true prey. Kane's cruel laughter echoed off the canyon walls as he and his men spurred their horses, eager for the final chase. Tala watched from the cover of the rocks, her heart shattering as she saw Ethan deliberately sacrifice himself for her. Tears streamed down her face, but she was a warrior, and her grief was a fire, not a flood. She knew the greatest way to honor his sacrifice was to succeed in her mission. As the last of the riders disappeared in pursuit of Ethan, she slung the treaty pouch over her shoulder, took a deep breath, and began the perilous climb up the rock face, her every movement fueled by a new, burning resolve. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. Ethan ran, his lungs burning, the thunder of horse hooves echoing behind him. He was not running to escape, but to buy time, leading the hunters deeper into the twisting maze of rocks and dead ends that he knew so well. He was a master of this terrain, but he was one man on foot against 6 on horseback. He knew it was only a matter of time. He found cover behind a narrow pass, firing his rifle sparingly, forcing them to slow down, to respect his skill. But his ammunition was running low, and his strength was beginning to fail. Meanwhile, high above, Tala had reached the top of the ridge. She was safe. Her path to her people was clear. She could fulfill her mission, honor his sacrifice. She looked back one last time, down into the canyon, where the distant pops of gunfire marked the last stand of the man who had saved her. But as she stood there, the treaty pouch heavy on her shoulder, she realized she could not leave him. He had fought for her world. She would not abandon him in his. She was Tala, daughter of a chief, a warrior of the Apache, and they did not leave their own behind. Her grief transformed into a cold, tactical fury. She was not just a warrior. Like Ethan, she was a strategist. From her high vantage point, she could see the entire layout of the canyon, the positions of Kane's men, the trap they were slowly closing around Ethan. And she saw something they, in their arrogance, had missed, a narrow, ancient animal trail that led directly to a precarious rock formation looming high above the pass, where the bounty hunters were funneled. With a speed and silence that was breathtaking, she moved along the ridgetop. She did not have a rifle, But she had her knife, her strength, and her intimate knowledge of the land's weaknesses. She reached the unstable rock formation. Below, Cain and his men were dismounting, preparing for their final assault on Ethan's position. Using a heavy branch as a lever, Tala put all of her strength, all of her grief, and all of her love into one desperate push. It started as a trickle of pebbles, then a cascade of stones, then a thundering avalanche of rock and earth. The rock slide, expertly triggered, crashed down into the narrow pass, not on top of the men, but directly in front of them, blocking their path to Ethan and, more importantly, blocking their only way out. Chaos erupted as horses screamed and reared, and the bounty hunters scrambled for cover. Their trap had become their prison. In that moment of confusion, Ethan seized his chance. He burst from his cover, not running away, but charging towards a stunned Jedediah Cain. The final confrontation was not one of bullets, but of raw, brutal force. The two men crashed together, a whirlwind of desperation and fury. But Cain, a bully who relied on numbers and fear, was no match for a man fighting for something more than money. Ethan, fueled by love and a renewed purpose, overpowered him, the fight ending with Cain unconscious on the dusty ground. As the dust settled, Ethan stood breathing heavily over his defeated foe. He looked up, and there she was, Tala, standing on the ledge above, her silhouette framed against the vast desert sky. She had come back for him. She had saved him. Their eyes met across the canyon, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They were not a savior and a victim. They were equals, a team, a force that, when united, was unbreakable. They took the pouch of coins from Cain's belt, the proof of Silas Croft's illegal bounty. With the hired guns trapped and disarmed, their leader defeated, the threat was finally over. A month later, they stood on the edge of the sacred valley, the heart of the mountain. Tala had returned the treaty pouch, and her people's future was secure. The corrupt land baron, faced with the evidence they had taken from Cain, saw his plans crumble into dust. Ethan had fulfilled his promise. He was prepared to leave her here, to return to his solitary life, his heart aching with the pain of saying goodbye. He turned to her, the words of farewell catching in his throat, but she simply smiled, reaching out to take his hand. She told him that she had honored her duty to her people, and now she had to honor her duty to her own heart. He had shown her a world of courage and honor she didn't know existed outside her tribe. My people are safe in their home, but my home is with my heart. She did not let go of his hand, and Ethan, the tracker who had trusted no one, the man who had lost his heart in the wilderness, realized he had not lost it at all. He had found it. He looked out at the valley, then back at her, and he knew his solitary days were over. Together, they turned away from the valley and began the journey back to his small cabin in the mountains. Not as two people from different worlds, but as two partners, ready to build a new world of their own. If you were moved by this story of healing and love, click the video on your screen now for another unforgettable tale from the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us what part of the story you loved most in the comments below. Your support helps us build our own family, right here